Good evening, and thank you all for joining the Crystal Lake Public Library tonight for Control the Chaos, presented by Assistant Professor of English. I'm just going to ask you how to pronounce your name. Aleisha Balestri?
You got it.
Yes. All right. Frankenstein is her favorite novel because it reveals so much about the human condition, and she's very excited to discuss it with everyone tonight. Please use the Q&A feature to ask questions that pertain to the content of tonight's presentation, and we will address them at the end. And if you're having any technical issues, leave that kind of questioning to the chat, and I will try to resolve all of your tech issues from there. Tonight's program will be recorded and hopefully available on the CLPL YouTube channel. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and I'm going to hand it on over to Aleisha.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to go ahead and get my presentation all set up here. Oh no. Oh, that was sharing. Sorry. Let's go to slideshow. There we go. All right. So like it was mentioned, Frankenstein is one of my absolute favorite novels of all time, and I am not alone in that. This is a novel that has been around for over 200 years, and it is also something that for whatever reason just really stays with us. It really is a story that has transcended not only genres, but also mediums and generations. I mean, even if you look at my presentation here, you can already see how much this has been adapted and reimagined, from the original 1818 Mary Shelley text to the very famous Frankenstein film, which is what, most of us know in pop culture as the Frankenstein story, to even Frankenweenie by Tim Burton. And this has become, to kind of help emphasize how popular and how kind of deep into our culture the story has become, I wanted to start today with just a little montage of, to just kind of emphasize how the story has really been around so often and just been readapted. So let me go ahead and click this.
Look, it's moving. It's alive. Yes, it's alive. 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 What was that?
All right, I think you guys get the idea. But the main point here is, as you can see, this has literally been adapted so often that it's been in TV shows, it's been in Marvel comics, it's been in, what was that? It's the original movie, it's just been in The Simpsons, it's everywhere. And today, one thing I want to really focus on is why. Why has this story been around for so long? What keeps on drawing us to this story? And although this is something that critics have been debating for years, and they may kind of debate on the specifics, one thing that almost all critics agree on is the fact that at its core, this is a story that is centered on the anxiety, tension, and fear that derives from human vulnerability. So in essence, we keep coming back to this because it reveals something about ourselves. So to begin, I wanted to define and unpack a few terms I'm going to be utilizing in this presentation to kind of help us understand why the story is just so unique in a sense. So human vulnerability. Human vulnerability can essentially be seen as a realization that despite our perceived dominance over our environment, we are just as vulnerable as anything else on this earth. We are not invincible, and this realization deconstructs our perceived stability, inducing fear and anxiety. Essentially, what I'm saying here is one reason that we are drawn to not only this story, but to stories within the horror genre in general, is that it really reminds us of a central aspect of the human condition, which is that we are not as invincible as we may seem, that we, although we have kind of dominated the world around us and manipulated the world around us and taken control of it, there is always this piece of ourselves that understands that this is not necessarily forever. There's always potential for something to happen. And again, this tension is played out in horror movies and stories for centuries, including Frankenstein. So one of the things we're going to examine today is what specifically makes Frankenstein and the creature in detail so horrific. Why, when we think of the creature and when we think of Frankenstein's creation and the act of creation, do we, what's the word, kind of, I guess, shiver, if you will? What makes it so daunting in that sense? And one way I want to kind of unpack that is by discussing these terms that philosophers and theorists have defined to help us understand what attracts us to horror. So the first one I'm going to define is Noel Carroll's category jamming. Category jamming is essentially the idea that animals and humans respond to their earliest experiences by internalizing a cognitive classification system based on the creatures they encounter. What this is essentially saying is that from the moment we are born, we are trying to categorize the world around us. We are trying to understand what things are, where they should place, and how we can move through it. And as he says here, after a certain time, however, the classification system solidifies into a cognitive framework. At some point, our understanding of certain categories, for lack of a better word, becomes solidified. They become hardened. It's how we view the world. And any subsequently strange and unclassified encounter thus produces fear. So to kind of connect this back, this is the idea that if something that we encounter is outside of the norm, if something that we encounter doesn't fit into our definitions or doesn't fit into our categories, it produces fear and anxiety. And this is why creatures of the undead are especially so common within the horror genre. If you look at these zombies here, one reason that zombies keep on showing up is because they transgress boundaries. They are neither dead nor alive. And thus this inability to really categorize them produces that fear and anxiety. And I'm sure some of you can already see how this plays out in Frankenstein as well. Another definition of fear that we're going to kind of touch on is the idea of cosmic fear. Cosmic fear is essentially a angst or uneasiness that resonates deep, what does it say here? That resonates deep with the intellectual awe of the unknown. Lovecraft suggests that all humans have an instinctual awareness of the paltry state of human understanding, especially when compared with the limitless domain of the strange and unfamiliar. That sense of fragility and vulnerability is a major aspect of cosmic fear that horror triggers in us. This is essentially our fear of the unknown. If you're like me and you've ever watched movies where people are floating into space or kind of being taken away by darkness, it again automatically just makes me feel uneasy, like something's not quite right there. And this concept of cosmic fear explains that the reason we feel that it's not right is because there is an instinctual awareness that there's something more out there, that we are much smaller and than we may seem, that when we look up into the sky and we look up into the universe, there is much more. And although that is fantastic and interesting and amazing, it can also be, terrifying. And so this goes back to that concept of chaos. Chaos in itself is the unknown. It is the uncontrollable. And although we may be fascinated by it, it also induces within us a deep sense of fear. Paradoxically, though, although fear itself is chaos and the unknown is chaos, the interesting thing is that chaos can sometimes be seen as the natural state of the universe. One definition I wanted to include in here, and this is a pretty simplistic definition, do your own research if you want to learn more about this, is the concept of entropy. And entropy is essentially a term that describes the amount of disorder or randomness within a system. And life itself can kind of be seen as a battle against order and entropy. As I say here, life is a battle against order and disorder. And when energy is not being placed into it, it has a tendency towards chaos. One simple way to think about this is think of our bedrooms, right? If you don't put any energy into the system, the bedroom is going to remain a mess. It's going to be disorganized and you're not going to be able to find anything. But when you begin to put energy into it and begin to try to kind of control and organize and organize the world around you, that chaos is diminished and that order is fulfilled. And then we might feel, more comfortable in that state. Water is another example of that. Water in a glass is ordered because it is maintained by a structure. But if that glass is spilled, then chaos reigns because the water is going to spread everywhere. So again, there's a constant battle in life between order and disorder. We often begin as chaos. We often begin as disorder, but it is the natural state of man to try to figure that out, to try to categorize it, to try to order it, to try to control it so that we can get dominion over it. And this, it's kind of hard to see, let me move that up there. This type of control can be seen as early as our first myths. Many of our creation myths begin with chaos, but end in human control. So if we look at an example of this, here, let me kind of move this to the side here, minimize that. For us, the creation myth, like the myth of hero's birth, inevitably has a psychological meaning. In the fact that cosmos is born out of chaos or nothingness, or the fact that a hero is born of a virgin, we find a metaphor of the awakening of consciousness from unconsciousness. In the creation myths themselves, the creation of the human being is a necessary step. In Judeo-Christian Genesis myth, for example, we find explicitly stated stated what is nearly always implied in creation myths, the idea that human beings are created to be namers, to apply their godlike powers of consciousness to recording creation and thereby providing it with significance. So what this is essentially saying here is the idea that we, again, thrive off of control. We thrive off the ability to define and categorize the world around us. And again, when something begins to disrupt that order, when something begins to challenge these preconceived notions of norms, we begin to feel threatened and scared, and we begin to feel anxious. And this can not only be seen in our understanding of myth, but also in our understanding of society at itself. Because again, society is the antithesis of chaos. It's the antithesis of entropy in the fact that we try to order the world around us. We try to create norms and try to have people follow laws so that, again, we can feel a sense of security. But oftentimes, especially in horror, there are threats to the system. Here is an excerpt from this really great book called Strangers, Gods, and Monsters, Interpreting Otherness by Richard Kearney. And in this book, he investigates why we are so fascinated with stories of monsters, of others, of strangers, of people or of creatures who seem to transgress the boundaries, and what that tells us about the human condition. And again, the reason I have this here is because this tells us something about Mary Shelley's novel and why, again, we are so attracted to it, why we keep coming back to this story, and how, again, it represents a piece of the human condition. In this book, he claims that strangers, gods, and monsters represent experiences of extremity, which bring us to the edge. They subvert our established categories and challenge us to think again. And because they threaten the known with the unknown, they are often set apart in fear or trembling, exiled to hell or heaven, or simply ostracized from the human community into the land of aliens. Let me unpack this a little bit. What he's essentially saying is that the figures of strangers, gods, and monsters often represent the agents of chaos. They represent a threat to the norm, something that is going to destabilize our structure and thus destabilize our feeling of security. And when that is destabilized, it invokes the theories of category jamming and the cosmic fear. It reminds us that we may not be as invincible as we once think, that we may be more vulnerable than we want to be. It reminds us of human vulnerability. And therefore, when we are faced with something that represents something unfamiliar or something unknown or something that can't quite be defined, our instinct is to ostracize them, is to see them as other, is to push them aside. We cannot define it, therefore we cannot control it. And thus, we want to get it away from us. Now, that was kind of my foundation of this idea of human vulnerability and how it applies to control and chaos. But like with anything in humanity, of course, there's always paradox. And one of the greatest tensions within the human condition and within human society is that the way that we gain more control, the way that we begin to dominate the world around us is through more awareness and through more knowledge. But the paradox comes in the fact that by trying to push boundaries, by trying to understand the unknown and define it for ourselves, we are potentially disrupting the norm and therefore potentially creating chaos ourselves. Here is a great quote from a book from called Gods and Robots, I believe. And in it, she writes, "Imagination is the spirit that unites myth and science. It's what reminds us that we may have the ability to transgress these boundaries, that we may have the ability to obtain more control, and then through more knowledge, we control more chaos." Okay, so then this leads us back to Victor, because this is both what's fascinating and horrifying about Victor. He is, and here, let me minimize this screen again. He is a figure that is talented, that is interesting, that is has done something no one else can, but he's also a figure that eventually becomes the agent of his own destruction. So one thing that we need to see, and again, we see the complexities of science and control and the potential to create chaos within Victor. As he tries to create artificial life in order to gain dominion over humanity's greatest unknown, which is life and death. Through his filthy creation, by trying to make an artificial life, he is essentially trying to understand the complexities of life and death and control it in that sense. Because if we think about all that we've accomplished thus far, the last frontier in many ways can be seen as life and death. Here, where was I? Okay, but before we can understand Victor's motivations, we must first look at his upbringing, because unlike his creature, who is born and raised in isolation and chaos, Victor, his cousin and eventual wife Elizabeth, and his siblings were happy products of control. So throughout this next part of the presentation, I really want to unpack what leads Victor to his filthy creation, and then how the creature also both is the antithesis of that, but mirrors it. And Victor, just like mankind, when he begins his story, actually begins by discussing paradise. As I said here, Victor felt that he was in his own form of Eden. Let me go ahead and read this quote. No youth could have passed more happily than mine. My parents were indulgent and my companions amiable. Our studies were never forced, and by some means we always had an end place in view, which excited us to ardor in the prosecution of them. It was by this method and not by emulation that we were urged to application. Elizabeth was not incited to apply herself to drawing, that her companions might not outstrip her, but through the desire of pleasing her aunt, by the representation of some favorite scene done by her hand. We learned Latin and English that we might read the writing in those languages. And so far from study being made odious to us through punishment, we loved application. And our amusements would have been labors of other children. Perhaps we did not read so many books or learn languages so quickly, as those were not disciplined according to the ordinary methods. But what we learned was impressed the more deeply on our memories. Victor believes that that his childhood was a symbol of perfection. We can see that here with no youth could have passed more happily than mine. But there is a sinister aspect to this. Yes, Victor was happy. Yes, he felt very loved, but this is a very controlled environment. This happiness is maintained because nothing outside of their definitions of pure, I guess, what's the word? Happiness, I guess, would be allowed into the system. They were indulged, right? As he says here, my parents were indulgent and my companions amiable. Our studies were never forced, and by some means, this excited us to ardor in prosecution of them. They were never pushed. There was never any negativity. And this was such an enclosed system that even Elizabeth, who is a cousin that has different parents, once she enters the Victor's home, her parents are never talked about again. And his best friend Clerval, he comes to the Frankensteins all the time. The Frankensteins is a place of happiness, but it is also a place of control. And because of this constant controlled, happy aspect, this constant controlled amiability, Victor never had the chance to really understand what it means to feel negativity, to feel grief, to feel unhappiness. It was always meant to be happiness. It was always meant to be perfect. And this can be seen even in the even with Elizabeth. As he says here, such was our domestic circle from which care and pain seemed forever banished. My father directed our studies, and my mother partook of our enjoyments. Neither of us possessed the slightest preeminence over the other. The voice of command was never heard among us, but mutual affection engaged us to comply with and obey the slightest desire of each other. So again, at first glance, this seems like a great place to be. It seems like, oh, there was never any, fighting. There was never any command. It was just perfect bliss. But I can't emphasize this enough. This bliss was created due to control. Again, everyone had to comply. Mutual affection engaged us all to comply with and obey the slightest desire of each other. Their happiness is controlled and maintained through love, but again, it's a very, very structured love. It doesn't allow anything else in. And as I said, you can see this even as they grow into adults. I have often heard my mother say that she, meaning Elizabeth, was at the time the most beautiful child she had ever seen, and showed signs even then of gentle and affectionate dispositions. These indications and a desire to bind us as closely as possible to the ties of domestic love that determined my mother to consider Elizabeth as my future wife, a design which she never found reason to repent. So Elizabeth, again, is someone who was outside the family and taken in. But the moment she is taken in, then without letting Victor or Elizabeth grow as individual adults, they're already pushed and told that they will one day be married. And this is something that occurs throughout the book. Anytime there is even a slightest sense of unhappiness, Victor's father reminds them, oh, you guys, once you guys are married, everything will be perfect again. It will bring happiness again. And so there's a pressure that comes through that as well, that we have to be happy, that we cannot allow negativity, that we must always smile and again be in perfect control. And because Victor grew up in this environment that was indulgent and that had nothing but happiness within it, according to him, again, it meant he didn't learn how to face negativity. He didn't learn how to understand what it means to feel pain or loss until it was one of the greatest losses any of us can have. His first misfortune and the only time he really had to face misfortune in his youth was his mother's death. The first misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as it were, of my future misery. She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest ties are rent by that most irreparable evil. The void that presents itself to the soul and the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she, whom we saw every day, and whose very existence appeared a part of our own, can have departed forever. That the brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are the reflections of the first days. But when the lapse of time proves the reality of evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. When Victor watches his mother die and has to say goodbye to her because he never had to deal with negativity before, it affected him immensely. It became something completely unbearable, something completely unheard of. In a sense, this is the first time that Victor has ever had to face something he couldn't control, ever had to face something he couldn't just, swat away. This is the first time he ever had to face chaos. But because Victor is who he is, and because he was always indulged and his boundaries were never really emphasized, his limitations were never taught him, because he never understood what it meant to truly process negativity and grief, this eventually leads him to his obsession. As I say here, this is the first spark that leads Victor to his doom. In this moment, he understands what it means to be in emotional pain, to be overcome by the uncontrollable. But perhaps through knowledge and energy, he could understand and define the intricacies of the system and thus exert more control over it. Victor, as he begins to learn more about the universe around him, as he begins to learn more about science and chemistry and life, he begins to believe that he can discover the secrets of life and death. As he says here, no one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards. Like a hurricane in the first enthusiasm of success, life and death appeared to me ideal bounds, which I should first break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. So right away, we see that he believes that he could gain the knowledge, that he could understand the chaos of life and death, and that he could figure out how to banish it. As he says, a new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. If he could create life, he could figure out the spark, the central aspect of who we are. And as he says, pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow an animation upon lifeless matter, I might in the process of time renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. his spur, his need to create artificial life is not only inspired by the need to perhaps create something that no one has ever created before, but he thinks that if he can create life, then he can renew life, that he can banish death, and perhaps even bring his mother back. All right, so although this may seem fantastic that, Victor is often, especially in modern interpretations, often described as kind of a mad scientist-like character. Although in Shelley's original version, it's more just, he's pushed towards madness, but not quite as intense as we see in the film versions. But again, although it may seem fantastic, this inspiration to transgress boundaries is actually quite common throughout history. For since the birth of mankind, we have tried to gain full dominion over the very nature of life itself. In fact, a majority of our advancements have been based on transgression. We are given the rules, but then we push past that. And although there may be tension and people may be like, oh, I don't know if that's a good idea, we keep doing it. We keep gaining further knowledge so that we can gain further control over the world around us. And this was no different within the 19th century. This was especially when chemistry began to emerge as a prominent branch of science, especially when it comes to experiments within electricity. And I have a little video here. One of the greatest discoveries of this time was the concept of galvanism. And although we understand galvanism as an electrical current that can kind of pulse through our bodies, back then it was before its limitations were known, it was seen to have much more potential. So I'm going to show you guys this brief video that I think explains that better than I can.
Electric medicine, sometimes called galvanism, after Luigi Galvani, is the act of using electricity to treat medical ailments. In the early 1800s, Galvani's nephew conducted sensational electrical experiments, often making use of a voltaic pile to demonstrate the effect of electricity on dead bodies. His most famous demonstration was on the recently hanged body of convict George Forster at the Royal College of Surgeons in London. Spectators looked on in wonder as they witnessed what looked like a dead man come to life. Electric medicine.
Okay. So let me get back to my presentation here. All right. So galvanism, since it was a relatively new science, seemed to bring energy back to inanimate bodies through movement. And many considered this as a potential tool that could actually be used to bring the dead back to life. In fact, Mary Shelley herself noted this, and she would have been aware of some of these experiments since it was, so big around Europe. And in her introduction to the 1830 edition Frankenstein, she actually calls it out directly. Perhaps a corpse could be reanimated. Galvanism had given token of such things. Perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endued with the vital warmth. So the idea of something being brought to life through electricity, through science, wasn't really too far off. But here we can see another paradox. Again, the idea of bringing the dead back invokes a thrill of transgression that can lead to ultimate control over death. And especially for Victor, you can see how this would be appealing. This creates a paradise where one's loved ones never cease to exist, and where the pain and grief that comes with death are completely vanished. But this concept is also quite, but to accomplish this, one needs to deconstruct our preconceived norms. Again, destabilizing the system and thus invoke fear and angst through category jamming. If we are to push and understand the mysteries of life and death, if we are to investigate the unknown, then we need to break through boundaries. But this inspires both awe and fear. And it's very easy for the fascination to soon turn to fear. In fact, as Stephen T. Asma in his book on monsters mentions how this may have inspired Shelley in some sense. The idea that science could penetrate the mystery of life itself and then manipulate it for its own end transformed from exciting to frightening almost immediately. Again, I really want to emphasize that this understanding is so powerful, it's so great, but because of that, it has the potential for such intense chaos, especially if manipulated in the wrong way or put in the wrong hands. So although there is the allure of having happiness and being able to do away with death and not have to say goodbye to a loved one, it also comes with it the anxiety of what this power could bring. So as he says here, whatever Shelley's original attitude towards scientific materialism, her book became the principal cautionary tale, warning us that science can go too far. That again, we have this assumption that we can control the chaos, that as we undo the threads of the universe, that we will have the potential to understand it, to control it, and use it for our own end. But that's not a guarantee. Things happen that we do not expect, and to assume that we would have that control is faulty. And again, this is what Shelley's book really emphasizes, that control and the assumption that we can maintain it can be very dangerous. So, as I said here, this concept is potentially why, so this is the concept that leads Victor to his filthy creation. And it's also the concept that, sorry, I lost my place here. It's also perhaps the reasoning why, even though Victor was so obsessed with creating this creature, so obsessed with creating artificial life, eventually his obsession soon turns to horror. And this, I guess, awe of life and death pushed him forward, but the realization of what he created is perhaps what makes the creature so horrifying in his eyes. As he writes here, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of pearly whiteness, but these luxuries only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dull white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and the breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Once his creation works, once it lives, once it literally becomes something that again transcends boundaries and definitions, that's when horror erupts. That's when Victor realizes the chaos he created. That's when he feels the angst and anxiety that derives from cosmic fear and category jamming. And that's what makes him flee. And this is also why, again, we fear monsters in general. As it says here, monsters by definition are unrecognizable. They defy our accredited norms of identification. They're unnatural, transgressive, obscene, contradictory, heterogeneous, mad. So in general, once the creature is born, because he is not born from natural means, because he is created, because he is in opposition to mankind, he becomes monster. He becomes unrecognizable. He becomes an agent of chaos, something that Victor feels that he cannot control, and thus he runs from. And again, Mare comments on this when she writes, since archaic times, the difference between biological birth and manufacturing origin marks the border between human and non-human, natural and unnatural. When something does not fit our definition of normal, we run from it. All right, so that's kind of how fear and the need to control led Victor down his dangerous path. I now want to shift gears a bit and discuss the creature, because the creature is very interesting. As we've already mentioned, he is defined as other within the book, as monster, as a threat to the organized system. But what's interesting is he also can be seen as a mirror of man, as a mirror of Victor, and his origins actually reflect the mythical origins of man. For example, just like with our creation stories, the creature's beginning begins with chaos. As he says here in his narrative, it is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of being. All the events that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time. And it was indeed a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses. So when he awakens, it is all coming at him at once. He is overwhelmed by the sensations of the world. Again, he begins with chaos. But he soon begins, just like man, to create an ordered system, to attempt to define the world around him and understand it, to gain more knowledge. As he says later, several changes of day and night passed, and the orb of night had greatly lessened when I began to distinguish my sensations from each other. He's beginning to understand the patterns of the world around him, just like we do. I gradually saw plainly the clear stream that supplied me with drink and the trees that shaded me with their foliage. I was delighted when I discovered that a pleasant sound, which often saluted my ears, proceeded from the throats of the little winged animals. So he's again noticing that, animals make sounds, that they are around him, that they are separate from him. I began also to observe with greater accuracy the forms that surround me and to perceive the boundaries of the radiant roof of light which canopied me. So again, the creature is able to begin to organize this system. But, and yet despite this parallel with man, because the creature was born into a system that has already been defined with its norms and expectations, what I mean by this is because he was born into the world of man, he cannot have the same trajectory as man. He essentially is viewed as a threat rather than a friend. He's really just in the wrong place at the wrong time. He does not fit into any definition and thus mirrors human vulnerability, invoking angst and terror. Because again, he is something other than man. So then what makes man, if this creature that is bigger, that is stronger, is there? It threatens our dominion over the world around us. And so in this sense, when the creature is born, we can kind of see Victor and the creature as seemingly opposing but similar forces. Victor represents is the embodiment of man. He has education, society, high class, beauty. And the monster, although he has the potential to have all of these aspects as well, because again, he is outside the norm, he is seen as an agent of chaos, angst, fear, as a monster. And as the creature began to learn more about the world around him, as he continued, left the woods and left the safety of nature and tried to further enter the world of society and man, he begins to understand the rules and expectations of man, and thus he also begins to define himself by them. As he says here, when he is watching the cottagers and learning what it means to live in this world, he claims, I had admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, their beauty, and delicate complexions. But how was I terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool? At first, I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror. And when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. He begins to see himself as opposite of man, as deformed, because again, he doesn't fit into these definitions. So just like man runs from him and sees him as a terror, as a demon, as something that will bring fear and chaos upon them, he begins to see it within himself. As he says here, of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was besides endowed with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as men. I was more agile than they and could subsist upon a coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs when I looked around. I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. Oh, that I had forever remained in my native wood, nor known nor felt beyond the sensations of hunger, thirst, and heat. As he gains more and more knowledge, he realizes his difference in an even deeper level. And he realizes that there is no place for him, that he is isolated, that he is alone, that he is ugly, and that he is loathed. And although he tries, despite all this, he tries to enter the world of man. He tries to fit into this world that he did not ask to be born into, but was brought into. But he is consistently rejected again and again and again. He is trying to be a part of something, to be a part of this system and control. But because he is other, because he is outside the norm, he is feared. And eventually, he becomes the monster that they define him as. He himself becomes an agent of chaos. And this can be seen from the very first, and this can be seen when the cottagers reject him, when he asks for their love and they turn on him with hatred. He finally gives in to his potential for chaos, gives in to his potential for disruption, and creates fire. As he says here, the blast tore along like a mighty avalanche and produced a kind of insanity in my spirits that burst all bounds of reason and reflection. Here he is given in to this chaos, to this uncontrollable nature. I lighted the dry branch of a tree and danced with fury around the devoted cottage, my eyes still fixed on the western horizon, the edge of which the moon nearly touched. A part of its orb was at length hid, and I waved my branch. It sunk, and with a loud scream, I fired the straw and heath and bushes which I had collected. The wind fanned the fire, and the cottage was quickly enveloped by the flames, which clung to it and licked it with their forked and destroying tongues. This image of fire with the creature, this image of fire as the unknown, as the destroyer, is again ignited here. And this is when the creature begins to turn. This is when he begins to rage upon man, to rage upon Victor. However, even though the creature lets go, and even though he submits to the chaos, he, like Victor, eventually attempts to control it. For similar to Victor, the creature is disrupted by inner chaos, by this inability to understand why he is not, well, to understand, but to want to be loved, to want to not be alone. And when he realizes that his reasons for being alone are because he doesn't fit into the definitions of society, into the definitions of the system, he attempts to create his own. He attempts to create his own version of Eden, of control, by asking Victor to make him a mate. As he says here, I now indulge of dreams of bliss that cannot be realized. What I ask of is reasonable and moderate. I demand a creature of another sex, but as hideous as myself. The gratification is small, but it is all that I can receive, and it shall content me. It is true we shall be monsters, cut off from all the world, but on that account we shall be more attached to one another. Our lives will not be happy, but they will be harmless and free from the misery I now feel. Oh, my Creator, make me happy. Let me feel gratitude towards you for one benefit. Let me see that I excite the sympathy of some existing thing. Do not deny me my request. Here again, he is trying to, this is again a mirror of Victor in a sense, because the creature wants a mate that he can love, but he is once again assuming that this is a mate that he can control. He is making the same mistake that Victor made when he created the creature. He believes that this unknowable, this unknown being can come to life, and that the creature will be able to literally take ownership of it, to have it, to force it to love him. But unlike the creature, Victor eventually has learned this lesson, that although you may create something, and although you may assume that this will be for the better, it has the potential to create further destruction and chaos. As Victor says here, and I won't read the whole thing, but he mentions that he had made this promise to the creature to make a mate, to give him a sense of love, to give him a sense of control, a sense of belonging. But he does not know what this creature will be. As he says, I was now about to form another being of whose dispositions I was alike ignorant. She might become 10,000 times more malignant than her mate, and delight for its own sake in murder and wretchedness. He had sworn to quit the neighborhood of man and hid himself in deserts, but she had not. And she, who in all probability was to become a thinking and reasoning animal, might refuse to comply with a compact made before her creation. He has made this promise, but she has not. He has claimed that he can control her, but that's not a guarantee. And furthermore, by creating a male and female creature, there is the potential for an entire new race to be put upon this earth. Even if they were to leave Europe and inhabit the deserts of the New World, yet one of the first results of those sympathies for which the demon thirsted would be children, and a race of devils would be propagated upon the earth, who might make the very existence of the species of man a condition precarious and full of terror. I'm going to pause there because, again, this is an example of a fight for control. And in this moment in the book, that is essentially the central tension, is a fight for control between the creature and Victor. And the creature wants happiness, wants others like him, But this is what Victor fears, because if there are others like the creature who is already stronger than man and more dominant, then it puts the state of man at risk. This is potentially could turn into a battlefield for literal dominion over the world around us. And so this is when Victor chooses to control the chaos, not through further transgression and creation, but to completely destroy it. As he says here, for the first time, the wickedness of my promise burst upon me. I shudder to think that future ages might cure me as their pest, whose selfishness had not hesitated to buy its own peace at price, perhaps of the existence of the whole human race. So he takes that last shred of hope away from the creature, and he thus destroys his mate, the creature's mate, and further unleashes the creature's fury. And throughout the rest of the novel, the creature and Victor continue to fight for dominance over one another's life, to fight for control. Okay, so this takes us back to our original question. Why are we still fascinated by this story today? And the reason why this story is still connected to us, the reason why we keep retelling it again and again and again, is because we are still in this battle for control over chaos. We are still questioning our own place within this system. Because as scientific progress continues on the trajectory it has, so does our anxiety about what comes next. So considering how Frankenstein mirrors the anxieties of today, to kind of shed some light on this, I pulled a passage taken from an article called Why Frankenstein Matters: Frontiers in Science, Technology, and Medicine by Dr. Audrey Schaefer. And in this article, she writes, science by its very nature is an exploration of new frontiers. It's a means to discover and test new ideas and an impetus for paradigm shifts. Science is equated with progress and with advances in knowledge and understanding of our world and ourselves. And although there's a basic tenet that's of science to question, there's also the underlying belief embedded that words like advance and progress will better our lives. So here we still have the assumption that progress is always good, that it will always make our lives better. And to be fair, a lot of it has. Our world today is so much safer and more comfortable and healthier than it was years ago. And we're only able to maintain that by transgressing boundaries. And we do have protocols in place to make sure that we do this in an ethical way. Because as she says, safeguard protocols and institution approvals by committees educated in the horrible and numerous examples of unethical experiments done in the name of science are used to prevent a lone wolf like Victor from undertaking his garret experiments. So this safeguarding is supposed to allow us to investigate the unknown, but to do so in an ethical way. But as she mentions here, these protections can only go so far. It is impossible to predict all of the consequences of our current and future scientific and technological advances. We do not even need to speculate on the potential repercussions of laboratory designed self-replicating species, as we can look to the unintended consequences of therapies such as drug thalidomide and controversies over gene therapies. This tension, this acknowledgement that unintended consequences occur is unsettling. And we have seen examples where we perhaps push ourselves too far, like the CRISPR twins that came out in 2018, where some twins' DNA were literally changed without their consent, and we don't know what the repercussions of that will be. And so what she's saying here is, yes, we should push for a greater future. We should push for progress, but we need to make sure that we step and think back to the possible consequences, that we, again, ask ourselves the, Jurassic Park question: just because we can doesn't mean we should. And even as we continue to move in the most ethical way, there's always the potential that something could go wrong. And this anxiety and fear is still with us today. And we're still telling the same story again and again about what happens when we continue to transgress these boundaries. As this great battle between control and chaos continues, so must we continue to reflect on the potential benefits and costs in the name of progress. And anxieties that were once represented within Frankenstein continue to be pondered today. Okay, so that's my presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Like I said, I really, really love Frankenstein. I wanted to kind of open it up now to any questions or comments you guys had about anything I talked about. I threw a lot at you, so.
Yeah, the Q&A portion, the Q&A is open. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the Q&A. And if not, just let us know. We'll hang out for a few minutes. I will ask a quick question. Do you have a favorite non-classical adaptation of the Frankenstein story?
I do. I actually had it on my final slide. That would be, I believe it was made in 2017, Ex Machina.
Nice. Excellent.
Yes, I love it's a kind of a, if you guys don't know it, it's kind of a gender bending version of Frankenstein. And it deals with AI instead of kind of the biological creation. So I think it's really interesting and kind of modernizes a lot of these anxieties.
Excellent. Let's see. We don't have any questions. So what drew you to Frankenstein in the first place? As just what draws anybody to anything?
Yeah. It was so weird. So I was weirdly enough just in undergrad and someone recommended it. And I've always heard the kind of classic Frankenstein story, right? Or not the classic one, but the 1930s film. And so I assumed it was going to be something like that. But then when I read it just out of curiosity, I really fell in love with it. I'm not a huge fan of Victor, but I really enjoyed reading the creature's narrative, because you always assume, especially if all you know is what the movie tells you, that the creature is not intelligent, that he might be innocent and simple, but not to the level of complexity that he is in the novel. So once I read that, I don't know, I was just drawn to it, and I keep on coming back.
Excellent. Gretchen asks, what can you compare the anxiety to today? So, yeah,
kind of like human vulnerability. Okay. So I think one thing that is really on the forefront today is gene editing and the creation of AI. Because especially as we continue to have advancements, especially in artificial intelligence and machine learning, we are also bringing up these interesting conversations on what happens if these creations become sentient, or as they become more human-like, how do we define them compared to us in that sense? And again, if they are creations, what does that also mean? Do they have rights? Do they have feelings? And how would you define that? And again, this is something that's kind of been through science fiction for a very long time. With gene editing, it's also kind of the same question. The concept of CRISPR has the potential to do so many great things, to get rid of so many diseases, to just really make the world a better place. But it also brings up questions of designer babies, and will people take this too far? So again, that's why I think the story stays with us, because that is that question of, I think Victor's journey to have dominion over life and death is something we can all relate to, right? This is something that would be amazing. And it's something, in a sense, we've kind of done. Every advancement has been to prolong our better life. But there's always the question of what will happen next, though. What is an unforeseen consequence that we might not have realized, and how will that impact the world around us?
Right. And how in a capitalist society, who controls what and who gets the benefit of these advancements?
Yeah, and exactly. And I think that's one of the biggest questions with like gene editing, especially, is that idea of like, this would be such a great thing, but like you said, in a society where money reigns king, is this going to create further divisions, further issues? And again, especially when it comes to children who don't have consent, that's something I don't think I mentioned as much with the creature, but he didn't consent to be born. He was,
Mhm.
again, brought into this chaotic world and essentially defined as a monster. And he did some horrible things, but you can almost, again, sense
Mhm.
like this was what happens when chaos reigns in that sense.
Could you elaborate on the CRISPR
Sure.
stuff a little bit, just so we can have a little bit of background on that?
Yeah, I know it very I didn't study up on it as much as I should have, but the idea is, I think my fiance knows more about this than I do because he's in biology, but it's essentially technology that is allowing us to literally investigate or kind of dissect genes and be able to place and change traits within our genes. Like with that case that happened, I forgot his name, but the twins who were essentially meant to be born having a resistance to HIV,
Mhm.
he essentially utilized some of that technology to kind of change those genes to make them resistant. But again, he did that without following the proper protocols.
Mhm.
And obviously, these twins didn't consent to it. The family didn't consent to it, and they're facing potential consequences. Again, it might have been a good idea in theory, but who knows what's going to happen in that sense. Yeah. Yeah,
That's heavy.
yeah.
Yeah.
Halloween, right?
Happy Halloween, everybody. So does anybody else have any questions? Drop them into
or,
the box.
or comments.
Or comments, any thoughts on what we've talked about tonight?
Or challenges, because there are lots of interpretations to the story. Or if I said something that was incorrect, like I said, I want to emphasize I'm not an expert on CRISPR by any means.
Right. Absolutely. So you're an English professor.
Mhm.
My question, I guess that would be like, how would you trace Frankenstein through science fiction in particular, if that's something that you feel comfortable talking on?
I think it's really, and again, if someone out there wants to correct me, please feel free, but I think it's considered by some as one of the first like modern science fiction adaptations.
Mhm.
As kind of the beginning to this. And it was created and recreated several times, even in Shelley's time. Because, what we know as the classic Frankenstein with like Igor and all of that, I believe, if I remember correctly, derived from a play that may or may not have been created when Shelley was still alive, but she also revised it at least a couple of times after that as well. But yeah, it's considered one of the first modern science fiction novels, which is really rad when you think about it.
Right, that whole like the whole genre is created by like a 19-year-old girl at a house party.
Yeah.
All right, Gretchen asks, do you think there's a little Frankenstein's monster in all of us? Do you think that we are stumbling through life feeling like outsiders too?
That, yeah, I think that's something else that, especially if you read Mary Shelley's version, which if you have not, obviously, I highly recommend it. I think that's something else that kind of complicates the story, is that we see a bit of Victor and a bit of the creature in us. In Victor, again, this is someone with ambition, and ambition's not bad by any means. Like I said, our world is a better place because of the advancements we have made. But we also see a piece of ourselves in the creature of, not belonging, of feeling excluded, like we don't fit in that sense. And luckily, as time has continued, we've been challenging some of these more complicated boundaries, some of these, I would say, more complicated, what's the word? Pitfalls that get in our way. We're challenging the system and trying to make it better for everyone. But again, this is a story that really highlights what it means to be an outsider and what that can potentially lead to. Because like I said in my presentation, the creature is really, his chaos is all internal. right? He is strong and he doesn't have the same limitations of that man does. He can live in the cold. He can survive off berries, but he's alone and he is seen as ugly, as other. And he begins to define himself as such as well.
All right, we don't have any questions and things, but I will ask the famous question. Who is the real monster?
We are. No, I'm joking. That is a hard one. You know, it's funny, in my class, I actually had my students debate something similar to that, where I had them debate whether or not the creature is actually responsible for his monstrous deeds. But I would say if we take it all the way back to who started all this, I'll go with Victor.
Sounds like a good idea. You know, if you're responsible for it, you got to take responsibility for it.
There you go.
Right. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was a wonderful, informative chat. I loved it. Thank you so much. Thank you all at home for joining us as well. And keep an eye on your mailboxes if they haven't already arrived. The beacon for your November and December library programs should be arriving if it has not already arrived, and registration for those programs is open. Thank you so much, Aleisha. It was an honor to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
And everyone else, have a wonderful evening and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye.